Everyone, thank you for coming out. I'm Kyle Cleveland with the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies here at TUJ. This evening we have with us Bo Jacobs, who's come all the way from Hiroshima. He's an associate professor at Hiroshima City University and is involved also with the Hiroshima Peace Institute. Bo is the author of a book called The Dragon's Tale, which is available both in English and Japanese, which is about nuclear culture in the United States. This evening is going to be talking about Global Hibakusha. You know Hibakusha are people who have suffered the effects of nuclear exposure. And obviously in recent years, in the last couple of years, we're all focused on this because of Fukushima. Bo has been working on this for a number of years. And I had the privilege of having Bo speak to my class here last year. And, you know, like a lot of scholars, I think, in Japan since 311, people have become very interested. I know of hardly any Asian studies scholar who's not trying to do something in some way related to 311. But there's often a difference between, you know, those who say and those who know. And I think in this case we have a person who really does know this field and has been working on it for a number of years and is doing some very interesting collaborative projects at the Hiroshima Peace Institute. So I feel very fortunate to have Bo here. And he'll speak for a while and then we should have time for Q&A. So let's welcome Bo Jacobs.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you all for coming out, and thanks to Temple for staging this event tonight. I'll speak just a second. I'll tell you my background and what I do. I'm an American, obviously. I have a PhD in history of science. I work on social and cultural aspects of radiation exposures in communities and social and cultural aspects of nuclear technologies. Be it mostly nuclear weaponry, but also nuclear power. And for some years now, for 4 years now, I've been working with a collaborator from Australia, Dr. Mick Broderick, on a project called the Global Hibakusha Project. And part of the idea of the Global Hibakusha Project is to work in radiation-affected communities around the world, of which there are an amazing number, and to try to examine the social and cultural effects that radiation exposures have had on families and on communities, and also to examine or to try to link these communities together so that they're no longer, so that they're able to, most of the people that live in radiation affected communities, primarily communities affected by nuclear testing, tend to still define themselves in relationship to the nation that irradiated them. So they see themselves as victims of US nuclear testing, Soviet nuclear testing, or French nuclear testing, and we're trying to link these communities together so that their voices can become more of a global voice of the radiation affected. So today what I'll do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of nuclear testing and the history of nuclear test site communities, and then a little bit about the nature of radiation contamination on community structure and personal identity. And obviously, a lot of this has great relevance in Tohoku. But we'll start just by looking at nuclear testing. There's the main reasons that people have been exposed to radiation, except for those who were exposed by the nuclear attacks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is by nuclear testing, by the development and production of nuclear weapons, and also by nuclear power plants and the development and production of nuclear power plant components like nuclear fuel. For example, in the United States, probably the most contaminated place in the United States is Hanford, Washington, which is contaminated because of its history of being a site of production of plutonium for nuclear weapons. Of course, the way that you produce plutonium for nuclear weapons is that you build nuclear power plants. So the first nuclear power plants in the world were built in Hanford, Washington. They were operated for several decades, and this has resulted in probably the most radioactive contaminated site in the United States. It's going to be a problem for a long time in the United States. Anyways, we'll look a little bit at sites of nuclear weapon testing. Since 1945, since the Trinity test in 1945, there have been over 2,000 nuclear weapon tests on Earth. Most of these have been underground, but hundreds and hundreds of them were above ground. There have been nuclear weapons tested on every continent except Antarctica and South America. And there have been nuclear weapons tested quite a bit in the oceans. This is not all of the nuclear test sites. These are the primary nuclear test sites. Russia, for example, tested in a large number of locations, but mostly in Kazakhstan. So out here you see the test sites out in the Pacific Ocean. There's testing in Australia. There's testing, of course, in India and Pakistan, in Israel. There's testing in Africa. The Soviets tested in both European and Asian Soviet Union. The Nevada test site in the United States, several test sites in the North and South Pacific. This is a chart showing the history of nuclear weapon testing and when it happened. As you can see, there was a huge spike in the late 50s and in the early 60s. This is almost entirely the United States and the Soviet Union. But of course includes now North Korea, Pakistan, India, and several other countries. There was a gap there that you see. This was a partial test ban agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union and the United Kingdom, the three nuclear weapons at the time, to cease nuclear weapon testing because of public opposition to nuclear weapon testing, because of the amount of fallout that was being generated by it. Today, we talk about, for example, when we talk about Fukushima, we talk about the levels of radiation versus normal background radiation. Half of normal background radiation comes from nuclear weapon testing. It's not normal. It's not normal background radiation. Now it's normal, but humans put that into the environment. So as we load more and more radiation, radionuclides into the environment, we create a new normalcy. You can see this with the way that radiation levels, the acceptable radiation, legally acceptable radiation levels for exposure to children and to people is raised. Those are just ways of establishing new normals. So background radiation, a lot of background radiation comes from all of these nuclear weapons, all this nuclear weapon testing in the atmosphere. These are the first 5 nuclear weapon states, the major nuclear weapon states, all possessing both thermonuclear hydrogen bombs and traditional atomic bombs. One thing and this is the years that, I don't know if you guys can see this or if it goes a little low. The US, Russia, Great Britain, France, China. Of course, one other thing that I'll point out about these 5 countries, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations, which is a clear demonstration to all that nuclear weapons equal political power. The next nuclear weapon states, India, Israel, Pakistan, and now North Korea. There are, of course, other countries that have programs pursuing nuclear weapons. Any country that has nuclear power plants has the option to pursue nuclear weapons. Power plants were invented, as I say, to manufacture plutonium. Nuclear power plants operated for over 10 years before they were ever used to manufacture electricity for public consumption. They were invented to produce plutonium. That's what they were used for over 10 years before a second application of producing electricity for public consumption and commercially using nuclear power plants was established. So nuclear power plants were designed to build nuclear weapons. Any country that does have nuclear power plants does have the option to pursue building nuclear weapons. Of course, there'll be political barriers, but in terms of the technological barriers, having nuclear power plants enables nuclear weapons. So it becomes a political choice once nuclear power plants exist. This picture is an underground test, so this is not an atmospheric test. There is occasionally venting, as you see here, from underground tests. Underground tests reduce the amount of radionuclides that enter into the atmosphere, and keep the radiation, more of the radiation on site at the nuclear test site, but they do vent, and there have been contaminations from underground nuclear tests as well. So we'll look a little bit at the testing, the global, or the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. When you test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, you create quite a lot more radioactive fallout than when you test nuclear weapons underground. This is why nuclear weapons are now tested underground, because of the public concern over the levels of fallout that were created by atmospheric nuclear weapon tests. For me, this photo is slightly ironic because this is actually an underwater test, but just a tiny bit underwater. This is the second test in Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands in 1946. Probably the most reproduced picture of a mushroom cloud, because it's just because of the boats underneath it, and it's just such a broad, a wide mushroom cloud, and that's because it's raised up so much water into the air. It's a very heavy mushroom cloud. So rather than just dust particles rising up, it's actually brought a lot of water up to the air, so it stays lower. In 1945, the first nuclear weapon was tested in New Mexico by the United States, the Trinity test. Then, of course, 2 nuclear weapons were used to attack the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only people directly, physically attacked by nuclear weapons. This is, of course, a different and a horrific experience of nuclear weapons. People in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'm sure everybody here knows, suddenly in 1 second, the world around them changed into a world full of fire and death and corpses and a hellish nightmare. It's as though the world just changed 1 second to another without any explanation. For most of the other people who have experienced nuclear weapon testing, they've experienced it not directly upon them, but near to where they live. And it has still had all kinds of consequences both on their health and on their communities. The first place outside of New Mexico and Japan to experience this was the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands were a trusteeship of the United States at this time. After World War II, they were under US political control. The United States wanted to refine its design of nuclear weapons after the attacks on Japan, and they wanted to develop lighter, more powerful, cheaper nuclear weapons. They wanted to test the effects of nuclear weapons on various materials. The first thing they wanted to do, one of the first things they wanted to do was to see what nuclear weapons would do to naval boats. That's why all of those boats are in that photo. All kinds of World War II naval boats from Japan, from the US, from Germany were all towed out to Bikini Atoll, where they were all put around this weapon that was detonated in order to see whether the boats would be recoverable afterwards. So the US was interested in testing the weapons to see its effects on material, to refine its design. It had a variety of reasons to be interested in testing nuclear weapons, and it decided that the Marshall Islands was the right place to test nuclear weapons because from their point of view, the Marshall Islands were in the middle of nowhere. These are the Marshall Islands. The testing was done here in the northern Marshall Islands at Bikini Atoll at Eniwetok. This is the capital down here in Montreal. So the testing was done here, but the wind, like it does in a lot of the world, blows west. So the winds blow this way towards these atolls over here in the northern Marshall Islands. In 1946, the United States Navy showed up at Bikini Atoll and explained to the people who lived there that God had created this weapon, and now the United States wanted to find a way to use it to maintain peace and to end war. And in order to do that, they needed to test this weapon in their home atoll. And they needed to evacuate. So the Bikinians were essentially given no choice but to evacuate their atoll. They have never returned. So there's now a third and fourth generation of Bikinians who have never been to Bikini. They have not been exposed to radiation. The Bikinians are lucky in this regard, but they have been removed from their home. They have been living as refugees in other people's lands ever since 1946. It was essentially a forced evacuation, although it was not done at gunpoint, but they really had no way to resist the US military's telling them that they needed to leave Bikini Atoll. Today, the Bikinians live, many of them live in Marginal Atoll, which is the capital atoll. This is what an atoll is. An atoll is the top of a underwater volcano. So it's not an island. It's a series of islands that essentially form a circle around the lagoon. It's very difficult out in the open Pacific to live on islands because it's fairly difficult to come and go by sea. However, when in an atoll, it's very easy because people simply come into the lagoon and then go out to sea from the lagoon. So these atolls in the Marshall Islands are very, very, very long, very, very, very narrow places. There are a lot of places on Marginal Atoll where the atoll is only as wide as the road. At other places, it can be a half a kilometer wide. It's rarely a kilometer wide. So it's a long, long, narrow place. This is a fairly tiny piece of land, but it now has over 30,000 people living on it. A lot of them are refugees. They are not the people whose land this is, so they don't have access to good parts of the land. They have had to live there through the kindness of the people of Marginal. Well, actually, I'll show you that on another slide. Here's another look of at Marginal today. As you can see, there's some parts that are a little bit more built up, but other parts that are very, very narrow. This is what it looks like today. This is some of the poor housing in Marginal. This is some of the poorer housing in Marginal. This is the kinds of place where a lot of refugees live. Some refugees live in containers, shipping containers. Still, this is generations of people. The Marshall Islands today, on the one hand, as I've learned, if you turn your camera towards the lagoon, it looks like paradise. It looks gorgeous. It looks like a dream come true. But then if you turn around and point your camera the other way, then it looks like the third world country that it is. So a lot of people in the Marshall Islands have been living like this for a long time. They live on government handouts, US government handouts of food and payments in compensation for being moved from their homes. Some of them do. And it's, as you can imagine, a fairly densely populated place. It's a difficult place to be a teenager because everybody knows who everybody is and there's nowhere to go except around a 20-mile or so road back and forth and back and forth. And it's to get anywhere else, you have to go by boat or by airplane. In 1954, the United States tested its first deliverable thermonuclear weapon, a hydrogen bomb. Within 10 years of developing nuclear weapons, the weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both the United States and the former Soviet Union developed thermonuclear weapons. Thermonuclear weapons use a different process to detonate, to create the force. As we know, in an atomic bomb, atoms are split. In a thermonuclear weapon or hydrogen bomb, atoms are fused together. And actually, to explode a hydrogen bomb, you first have to build into it a traditional atomic bomb with split atoms to create heat sufficient enough to then set off the thermonuclear component of the bomb. So it's a two-stage process. It's both an atomic and an H-bomb. That's how you can achieve an H-bomb detonation. This principle was tested by the US and the Soviet Union earlier than in 1954, but in 1954 they both developed deliverable weapons. Here is This is a map of Bikini Atoll, and you can see there's actually a crater dug out of the island where the bomb was set off. This bomb, the Bravo bomb, was an immense bomb. It was the largest bomb the U.S. tested. The Soviet Union has tested a larger weapon than this. To give you an idea of it, this is a photo taken from 70 miles away. But most importantly, the United States learned from this test. Oh, thank you. The United States learned from the Bravo test that the most effective military tool that a nuclear weapon, a thermonuclear weapon, makes available to you is radioactive fallout. The force, the blast and the heat of a thermonuclear weapon is substantially bigger than that of a traditional atomic bomb. But the amount of radioactive fallout is on a much larger scale. The force is over 1,000 times larger than of the bombs used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But, for example, this is a map of the fallout cloud from the Bravo test in 1954. So here's where the device was detonated. This is where the cloud went out to. All of these atolls here, Rongelap Atoll, Rongerik Atoll, all of these atolls were affected by this radioactive cloud. Over here is where the Fukushima, the Daigo Fukushima, the Lucky Dragon boat was. So it was about a little less than 100 miles away from the detonation point of the bomb. The fallout, probably many of you know this story, but this is a tuna fishing boat, a Japanese tuna fishing boat. There were over 100 fishing boats that were affected by this radioactive cloud, but this is the famous one. This boat, they did not know that there was a weapon tested. They were the exclusion zone that the U.S. believed it had kept people out of was about 50 miles from ground zero. They were located almost 100 miles away. About 3 hours after the bomb went off, ash started to fall on this boat, thick ash. They didn't have any idea what it was at all. Now, this is a tuna trawler. This is a tuna boat, so they're out to sea for quite a while. They're catching tuna out by the Marshall Islands, and then they come back to Japan. When the boat got back to Japan, which was 3 weeks later, every crew member was sick from radiation sickness, and one crew member died as a result of the exposure from the radioactive ash that fell on the boat. So one of the things that we learned from this was you can be 100 miles away from ground zero of a thermonuclear weapon and it can kill you. It was actually this test that put the word fallout into public usage. Before this test, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to contain public awareness about radioactive fallout. But after the Lucky Dragon came back into port 3 weeks later, and everyone was so sick, it became a front-page international news story that the boat had been exposed to this much fallout and that everybody was sick, and then that somebody died. So suddenly, the word fallout is used. It's almost impossible to find it in public sources before March of 1954. But after that, there's endless articles, newspaper and magazine articles published about radioactive fallout, and fear of fallout begins to rise dramatically around nuclear test areas. There's a couple things that I would say about this fallout cloud. One of the asides that I would say is that the United States, to understand the scale of danger of this weapon, this one weapon, they superimposed this map on the eastern seaboard of the United States and tried to imagine if this bomb had been detonated on Washington, D.C., and if the winds had blown to the northeast, what would that have meant? And what they determined was that if this same bomb had been dropped on DC and the winds had blown in the way they designed, the exact same cloud, but if it just went the directions they designed, which of course is not exactly what would happen, but in theory, everybody in Washington, DC, everybody in Baltimore, everybody in Philadelphia, everybody in New York would be dead unless they evacuated within a week. So this is a different scale of weapon than the kind of weapon that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both the United States and the Soviet Union began to design war plans that involved blanketing the enemy country with sufficient radioactive fallout to kill everybody. The United States was well aware that had it executed its war plan, it would result in the death of everybody in Korea and Japan, because that level of radiation would blow through Korea and Japan from the Soviet Union. This is the nature of the nuclear war that they had planned. The people in the Marshall Islands that lived in these downwind atolls, the United States did not expect this weapon to be so big, and they did not expect the levels of fallout to be nearly so dramatic. So the United States military and the United States Atomic Energy Commission was in a complete panic and pulling all of their personnel back because they were freaking out because there was such high levels of fallout everywhere. A radioactive monitoring team came to Rongelap, the most populated of the atolls that was exposed. The people on the radioactive monitoring team panicked and left immediately. 2 days later, a boat showed up and said to the people of Rongelap, you have 1 hour to gather whatever belongings you want, and then you're being taken from this atoll forever. They still live as refugees, the people of Rongelap. However, they did receive significant amounts of exposure to radiation. There was a lot of radiation sickness, and there was a lot of cancer that developed in that community as a result of the exposure to the Bravo fallout. The Soviet Union tested 456 weapons, not all in Kazakhstan, but it was one of their major places where they tested. They tested in not far from the border of China and Mongolia, in northeastern Kazakhstan, near the town Semipalatinsk, in a place they chose their nuclear test site because they said the Kazakh people are nomads and don't really have a culture or a home. So therefore, there's no problem with testing weapons near where they live. These are a few of the nuclear weapons tested there. The United States had a policy, I'll talk in a minute about the Nevada test site. The United States had a policy of testing small regular A-bombs, fission weapons in Nevada, and thermonuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. So the big weapons with lots of fallout were tested where the Marshallese live. The smaller weapons were tested in Nevada. The Soviet Union tested both here in Kurchatov in Kazakhstan. And whereas fallout that enters into the Pacific Ocean from nuclear testing in the ocean is still in the ecosystem and still has and some of the particles have a long life. In Kazakhstan, these same weapons were tested on land. So a lot of this fallout came down where people live. And a lot of these areas remain contaminated today. They also experimented with what was called peaceful nuclear explosions, which was the idea of using nuclear weapons to geoform, to build harbors, to make canals, to move large amounts of earth. This was a test of theirs, the Chagan test, that resulted in this huge crater filled in with water. In the West, we refer to this lake as Atomic Lake. In Kazakhstan, it's called Lake Chagan. It is extremely highly radioactive. At one point, a Soviet health minister came to try to convince the local people that it wasn't dangerous, and he jumped in the lake to swim around and show them, and he was dead within 2 years. This is unguarded. People can just go up to this lake in Kazakhstan. The areas around it are highly contaminated, and people can just wander through it, and animals can just wander through it. There's a similar site like this, crater like this, at the Nevada test site, but it is not open to the public. It is not someplace that people would ever be able to go to. There are a lot of victims and a lot of illness in Kazakhstan as a result of nuclear testing. This is the memorial that they built to nuclear victims in the nearby town of Semipalatinsk. Kazakhstan, this is a section of Kazakhstan that is very economically poor. The people really are not given any help. They live in contaminated lands. People garden. I've been to the villages near the test site there. The lands are contaminated. People have no choice but to grow their food in their yards, and they subsist quite a bit off of horse milk. It's a staple in the diet there, and of course the horses just graze on the very same grass. And every year the Kazakh government asks the Russian government to clean this site up and to try to decontaminate this land. And they say, we didn't do that, the Soviet Union did that. And the Kazakh government says, we didn't do that, the Soviet Union did that. And so nobody is helping these people at all. And they just simply are living in contaminated areas and raising children in contaminated areas. The Nevada test site in the United States has had the most nuclear tests of any place on Earth, 928 nuclear tests. In 1951, the United States started to have troops participate in nuclear tests. Almost all nuclear testing countries that tested in the atmosphere had soldiers participate in maneuvers under mushroom clouds. These soldiers are another group, another cohort of people who are radiation-affected hibakusha. They have tried to organize in the United States, in France, in the UK for compensation for their health problems, recognition of the trauma that they experienced. They have not tried to organize in Russia. I don't believe they have in China either. These troops, typically what they would do is they were as close as between 2 to 3 kilometers away from ground zero at these weapon tests. They would be down in these trenches, and the weapon would be detonated, and they would get up out of the trenches and march into the mushroom cloud. The whole point, there's several points to having these troops participate in nuclear tests. There really is no need to practice maneuvers with an actual mushroom cloud there. You can practice the maneuvers without the mushroom cloud and the radiation there. The United States was very concerned that soldiers would not obey orders in the presence of a mushroom cloud and of the detonation of a nuclear weapon, and that they would be so afraid that they would just simply panic and run away. So they would do things like have them, right after the weapon goes off, have them disassemble their rifles and reassemble their rifles to see if they could focus on tasks and follow previous training. They would do fear assessments of them right under the mushroom clouds, but mostly what they wanted to know was that soldiers would follow orders in a nuclear battlefield, and so they frequently rose up out of their trenches and advanced through the mushroom cloud. The idea being that this is a ground war, so you have pierced the enemy's front, you've let off a weapon, so there's now a hole, and the soldiers need to penetrate through there, and so they would find out if the soldiers would follow orders. And so, as you can see, this is a very dusty environment. A lot of these soldiers, the blast wave from this weapon would kick up a tremendous amount of dust. They would be exposed to some amount of gamma radiation from the test, but one of the real dangers, and this is one of the stories up in Tohoku as well, is alpha-emitting particles, which are small particles that become ionized, they become radioactive, and they're not very strong. It's not very strong radiation, but if they're internalized into the body, they can lodge in a place in the body, and a very low level of radiation will just hit the same cells for 10 years or 20 years, and they can cause cancers. A lot of the soldiers who did this sort of thing have developed what are known as ingestion cancers, cancers from swallowing or breathing in radioactive particles. Lots of them did breathe in a lot of radioactive dust. This sort of exposure is very difficult to trace, and it tends to be ignored by a lot of epidemiological studies of radiation exposure, which focus on gamma radiation, which is the waves of radiation. So it's fairly easy with a Geiger counter to detect gamma radiation, more difficult to detect small amounts of alpha-emitting particles, which can be present. These soldiers experienced both, but it's very difficult for them to prove that their cancers are related to their exposures. The only cancers that are compensated for the service personnel are very rare cancers that typically can have no other source than exposure to radiation. Anything like lung cancer or stomach cancer or throat cancer or bowel cancer that can come from swallowing particles, they get no compensation for because they can't prove that it was caused by the radiation. This is a map of the fallout across the United States from all of the nuclear weapon tests in Nevada. There was a significant amount of fallout all throughout the country. People began to be alarmed in the mid to late 50s. There began to be stories in the press. The first one was of a physics class in upstate New York that went outside to measure background radiation and found extremely high levels of radiation. This was because it had rained the day before, so one of the mushroom clouds from a test in Nevada, the radioactive particles had come down with the rain because fallout tends to come down with precipitation in heavier amounts. So they found significant amounts of fallout radiation from a Nevada test in upstate New York. I think this was in 1955. So people began to find radioactive contamination far from the Nevada test site in the United States, and this is one of the things that raised a lot of concerns about downwind fallout. The British began to test nuclear weapons in Australia. They tested nuclear weapons in the outback of Australia because, quote, nobody lives there. There were very tiny precautions taken to keep people out. For example, there is a sign telling you this is a prohibited area, but of course it's written in English, which is not the language that the people who lived there read at the time. Sorry, I realized I left out the British testing in the Pacific, but the British also tested quite a lot of weapons in the Pacific. These are Aboriginal Hibakusha in Australia today, telling the stories of what happened and what they were told. Most of them were told that it was perfectly safe to come back to these areas where the testing had been done. They were told nothing about precautions to be taken. For example, a staple in the diet for many of these people is rabbits, and rabbits burrow down into the ground, which still holds a lot of radioactive contamination. So this community has also been quite affected by exposure to fallout. The French began to test in Algeria at first. They had a lot of mishaps where the tests that they did in a tunnel in the side of the mountain blew the side of the mountain off. There was a lot of contamination around the site, the two sites in Algeria where the French have tested. There's very little precaution. Here's a photograph of one of the areas today where that mountain blew up, and there's a sign that says danger, but as you can see, anybody can go in there that wants to. And people have tended to dig through this mountain to pull out the copper cable and sell it for scrap. So there's really very little protection at all for the people who live in this area, who were first exposed to the radioactive clouds and now simply are living with contamination in nearby areas. The French then went on to the South Pacific to test for the big weapons. 193 French nuclear tests in French Polynesia. The French did things like jail opposition leaders for political crimes in order to contain political opposition to nuclear testing in French Polynesia. I'm just hurrying through some of these. The Chinese tested in an area called Lop Nor in western China, in northwestern China. This is the area where the minority Uyghur population lives, which is a Muslim population. These areas there are not very many researchers that have been able to get into these areas. We have yet to visit this area or to be able to get very much information except for a few articles that people have written about some of the health effects there, and as well as some of the cultural, the things that people were told and the limitations on travel in some contaminated areas now. But I'll shift now from talking about these sites and a little bit of the history of nuclear testing in these sites to talk about nuclear power plant accidents. Nuclear power plant accidents, there have been a couple, as everybody knows, a couple of very large nuclear power plant accidents. In the nuclear industry, there is what's referred to as the bathtub curve. In other words, nuclear power plant accidents typically are anticipated to happen in the beginning few years of the operation of a plant or in the last few years of the operation of a plant. And if plants are operating stably, they will tend to operate stably for some period of time. And then there may be problems in the end when a lot of the equipment is brittle. Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island were nuclear accidents that happened at the beginning of that curve in the first few years of operation. Fukushima Daiichi is the first of the tail end. But since so many nuclear power plants are having their licenses extended from 30 or 40 years to 50 or 60 years, the likelihood of additional nuclear power plant accidents only gets higher because of continuing to operate old plants for longer than they were designed to operate. Chernobyl itself, as we know, is essentially considered a dead zone now. There's an area of about 30 kilometers around that people are not supposed to live inside. Some people have gone back to live inside this area, but when we think of Chernobyl, we tend to think of these kinds of dystopic, end-of-the-world images of a former inhabited area that is now off limits to human beings. Here in Japan, of course, there was 3 meltdowns and an additional explosion at the Fukushima Daiichi plants in March of 2011. There's differing perceptions about how much of a dead zone there is or will be around these plants. People were evacuated out to 12 kilometers. They were advised to evacuate to 20 kilometers. The reason that there's a difference in those two numbers is that if you tell people they have to evacuate, you are now financially responsible for them evacuating. If you suggest to people that they evacuate, it's their financial burden if they decide to leave. This is one reason, in my estimation, that the forced evacuation zone was kept small to limit the liability. This puts a lot of burden on the people themselves. In the first weeks of the event, I'll talk a little bit about the identity of people exposed to radiation. First in Tohoku. In the first weeks of the event, of the meltdowns, a number of plant workers were exposed to high levels of radiation. Here they are being removed from the site. You'll notice, of course, that they are being kept under a tarp. This was done at the request of TEPCO. This is for several reasons. One is to hide the identities of these people so that they will not suffer the stigma that accompanies people knowing that you've been contaminated by radiation. I would suggest that this is a kind of cloaking and a kind of loss of identity that a wide variety of people are experiencing in this area. This is just symbolic and official version of it. When people are exposed to radiation, they end up becoming separated from the general population, if not physically, then emotionally and conceptually. Here, there's a difference between the people who are wearing protective garb and the people who are not wearing protective garb. The people who are normal, the people who are potentially abnormal, and we need to verify or check to what extent we can their abnormality. People who have been exposed to radiation, in a sense, begin to have a new identity, the identity of an irradiated person. There are a lot of things that come along with this identity of being an irradiated person. One thing is a lifetime of uncertainty when you have health problems, a lifetime of anxiety, a lifetime of difficult decisions in which you are isolated, choosing whether to remain in areas that you believe could be dangerous to your health and to your children's health, or choosing to abandon those areas, in which case you're dealing with potentially the breakup of families or the breakup of community, and the dissolution of tradition. But being exposed to radiation changes people. Being exposed to radiation puts people into a different category in which their rights are not recognized in the same way that the rights of other people are, the rights to the integrity of their families and their health. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. The area around the plants itself, you can begin to see the dead zone taking hold, the notion of abandoned land, land that is no longer under human supervision or human control. This area may grow larger, it may be kept small. We'll find out about that. There's a continuing entry of radionuclides into the environment. There will be a continued entry of radiation into the environment for the foreseeable future. What the long-term impact of that will be is something that time will tell us and that expertise doesn't yet know. But I'll look a little bit at some of the structural things about exposures to radiation for people and for communities. The people who are first selected to be exposed to radiation, the people who live near nuclear test sites, who have nuclear test sites nearby them. By the way, this is the US telling the Bikinians that leaving their homes for the rest of their lives is going to help make the world peaceful. You can see the power relationship of the Americans and the Bikinians in this photograph. Nuclear test sites are located near marginal populations in the far colonial areas of nuclear testing countries. The French did not test nuclear weapons near Paris. The Soviets did not test nuclear weapons between St. Petersburg and Moscow. The British did not test in the UK. Empires, military empires, nuclear powers choose populations with no political power and no ability to defend themselves to be the populations that are subjected to radiation exposures. When a country does test within their own borders, they find marginalized populations within their own land area for whom to expose. The Soviets chose the Kazakh people in America for the Nevada test site. This site was located near Native Americans and Mormon communities, which at the time had no political power at all and were fairly marginal communities. The Chinese tested near the Uyghur community, who also are a community, an out community. But of course the French tested in Algeria, the French tested in the Pacific Islands, the United States tested big weapons which were too dangerous for Americans in the Marshall Islands. The UK of course tested in Australia and out in the Pacific Ocean as well. So nuclear colonialism looks for marginal populations. These populations typically experience a loss of land. They experience sickness and death. They experience changed lifestyles. And they experience social dependence. I'll talk a little bit about these. Land is contaminated with radionuclides, and you cannot really decontaminate land when it's contaminated. Radioactive particles, there's a wide variety of radioactive particles that result from nuclear weapon testing or from nuclear power plant accidents. Some of them are dangerous for a very short time. Some of them are dangerous for a very long time. The ones that are dangerous for a very long time just stay dangerous for a very long time. You cannot make them go away. You can simply move them around through the ecosystem. Often when you try to remove them and, quote, decontaminate land, dirt, trees, things like that, you are simply moving them around in that ecosystem. They're notoriously difficult to remove. The United States tried as hard as it could to decontaminate those boats from the Bikini test, and they failed. There was no way to decontaminate those boats. They stayed radioactive forever. They are now, by the way, sunk in the shallows outside of San Francisco Bay. There's a contamination of livestock. These are sheep in Kazakhstan that are radioactive. Populations in a lot of these poor areas, which is where almost all of these contaminations happen, remain dependent on locally produced food. A lot of times that food remains contaminated, and there's really nothing that people can do about that. And this kind of thing, the contamination of land, the contamination of food sources, it results in a never-ending anxiety in these families who know that they and their children are potentially consuming things that will cause them health problems, but they don't have any other options. In the Marshall Islands, the Rongelapese were returned to Rongelap for a short period of time after they were told, or not such a short period of time, but they were returned by the U.S. after the U.S. supposedly decontaminated Rongelap and cleaned Rongelap up. Except, of course, that there were some parts of the atoll where supposedly people shouldn't go, and some beaches in the lagoon where they shouldn't fish. Well, of course, fish don't obey boundaries. Fish just go where fish go. So if the fish are dangerous on one part of the atoll, the fish are dangerous all around the atoll. And when you have people living in that kind of poverty, they're not going to not eat fish because they think it might be a little more dangerous. They're not going to choose starvation over the uncertainty that comes with eating contaminated food. So a lot of these populations who remain in contaminated areas have no choice but to consume food that may be contaminated. This results in tremendous anxiety. This is the kind of anxiety that the Hibakusha in Hiroshima and Nagasaki have known. The feeling that every time your child coughs, every time your child's fever goes up, this could be radiation coming and taking your child from you. Every time you get sick, you think, this is it. Finally, it's come to kill me. This is an anxiety that gnaws away at people. When it's said that the victims, for example, in Tohoku, that the reason people are sick is because of anxiety, even if that's true, this is an anxiety that was not their fault. It was a situation they were put into, and even the problems that come with anxiety, of which there are plenty, are a form of victimization. It's not self-victimization. This is done to people. People in contaminated areas are very often evacuated from their homes into temporary housing, which in almost every case becomes permanent housing. This has a great destructive effect on community and family. People frequently have lived traditional lifestyles for generations, living in the same place, doing the same things, farming, fishing, raising livestock that their ancestors have done for generation after generation. There's a continuity, there's a sense of identity and connectedness to land, connectedness to community, connectedness to family that comes with this kind of lifestyle. And when people are suddenly put in housing, this is the Bikinis, this is where they were first put, in U.S. Army tents. In U.S. Army tents, living, eating food out of cans, eating processed American food with no work to do, with nothing, no traditional activities to do, but simply to sit around and be compensated for being removed from their lives. Almost every case in which this has been done in a radiation-affected community, this is followed by depression, suicide, high divorce rates, high drug use and alcoholism. What follows when people's traditional lives break down is not new good lives. It has not yet been the case, especially because these are populations who, in essence, are being told that your life is just not so important as other people's lives. We can just move you someplace, and we can just take away the things that used to give you the basics of your identity, and that's okay because you've been exposed to radiation. This is a part of how people who are exposed to radiation become second-class citizens who no longer have the rights to a life of integrity that other people can demand and expect. But one of the worst things that comes with this kind of dislocation from land is a disruption of spiritual traditions and continuity of community and connection to ancestors. One of the ways I've tried to explain this here in Japan, this is true in almost every community where people have been removed from traditional lands. In Japan, up in Tohoku, for the people who lived in the forced evacuation places, so they cannot return to their homes because their homes are radioactive, their lands are radioactive. So, for example, during the holiday of Obon, these people are unable to return to maintain the graves of their ancestors. They are unable to return to perform rituals of connectivity and honor for ancestors. This really harms people. This kind of disconnection from ancestry and from tradition is one of the worst things that happens in the Hibakusha communities that I've studied. It's possible. I typically speak with people who have been exposed to radiation 40 years ago or 50 years ago, and they're looking back on their lives and telling me about how their lives have gone since these exposures. And the stories that I hear from them make me have a lot of sadness for what's going on in northern Japan now. For example, the kinds of things they've said about their disconnection from their ancestors, their inability to maintain their ancestors' graves, for example. The people in Rongelap can't go back. The people in Bikini can't go back and maintain the graves of their ancestors. And as we all know, our lives are built on our ancestors. For a year or 2 or 5 years, you can tell yourself that this isn't my fault. This is because of the US government, or this is because of the radioactive meltdown, and I'm unable to perform this ritual, and I'm unable to maintain this link and to give honor to my ancestors. But almost all of the people that I've talked to, when it's 50 years later or 40 years later, they feel as though they have broken a chain that goes back as far as they know in time. And their lives, they are the one who broke it. And they feel like it's their fault. They don't, even though they know it's not, that it's because of external circumstances, emotionally, they feel disconnected. They feel disconnected and they feel changed. There is, in northern Japan, there is some attempts to try to carry out some rituals, and there have been some maintaining of graves in the radiation area. But this is what I would say is that because of the centrality of the health problems for people who are exposed to radiation, the little bit of compensation and the little bit of structured social support that radiation exposed victims get is almost entirely focused on checking health or dealing with health problems. It's the most immediate and the most important thing. But the emotional health of families that are disintegrating, of communities that are no longer whole and no longer together, and of people's individual psyches when they are broken from their traditional lives, their traditional diets, their traditional work, their connection with their ancestors, nothing is ever done for people. And these things take a tremendous toll on the well-being of these individuals, these families, and these communities. And so one of the things that I would say is that right now, we are in a situation where we are less than 3 years into this disaster here in Japan. People have been evacuated. There's uncertainty about whether to evacuate more people. There's a lack of compensation for some things. For example, people who have lost businesses, people who self-evacuate have to take care of this cost by themselves. People have been living in temporary housing for periods of time, and it gets presented to us as though this is an unprecedented disaster. And we're scrambling, trying to figure out what to do as a society or as a government. And what I would suggest to you is that there is a long history of radiation-affected communities being disrupted. And it's fairly easy to see what is ahead for people who've been exposed to radiation, people who have been evacuated from their homes, people who live in that kind of uncertainty. But to recognize this history, to recognize the precedent of all of these thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people who have been affected by radiation around the world, to recognize this precedent would be to have to take responsibility for what lay ahead for these communities and these individuals and these families. So it's a lot easier to just act as though this has never happened before. We're really not sure how people are going to adjust to temporary housing. We're really not sure how, if people are going to be able to start new lives in new careers or with some training, if communities can come back together. We already know a lot about what's ahead, but knowing that and being honest about that will force us to understand the really difficult position that we have put these people in and the difficult futures that lay ahead that we as a society are not necessarily willing to take responsibility for. So what I would suggest is that which is of course just a simple thing to suggest, which is just what we all know, is that we need to support the community of people in Tohoku. We need to support them in more ways than just hoping government programs actually happen, hoping compensation actually comes. As members of our society, these people have entered now because they are the people that this accident thrust into this identity of being radiation exposed, the reality of being radiation exposed, the health problems that come with that, but also the identity of being people that can be sacrificed by society. We need to fight against what's ahead for these communities, and we need to do everything we can to be inclusive of these people who have experienced this. Whether the radiation ends up giving health problems to people or whether the radiation merely gives people lives of anxiety and disconnect. So on that happy note, I'll conclude and ask, and I'm happy to answer any questions at all.
Thank you very much, Bob. We are contractually obligated to finish here by 9 o'clock, so we don't have a lot of time. So if I could ask if you could please limit your questions to questions and not monologues, that would be appreciated. Anybody have any questions? Yeah. Please use the mic because we're recording this.
Hello, my name is Drake. I'm a senior at Tokyo University, Japan. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just had one question when you were talking about people on the atolls.
Yeah.
You said they were most likely forcibly evacuated, or that it wasn't put that way. But I read up into it, I thought there was two options. It's either you're contained or you evacuate, or was it a quarantine, like you stay in your home? Like, was that not an option for those people, or was that an option in the future?
Thank you very much. In the Marshall Islands, that was not an option. The people from Bikini were all evacuated ahead of the tests and remain and don't live in Bikini again. The people on the 4 atolls, there were more atolls that were affected, but it's referred to the 4 atolls that were affected by radiation from Bravo. They were all forcibly evacuated. They were then brought back after the atolls were supposedly cleaned up and then later re-evacuated. But those people did not have the option to stay. People in other test site communities, for example, in Kazakhstan, people lived fairly close, 10, 15, 20 kilometers away from the test site. Those people all just stayed in their homes. For the first test, some of them were evacuated out. But after that, the people stayed in their homes through the tests. people in Nevada, there weren't people living close enough to the test site because the test site was big. But in the atolls themselves, the people were evacuated. Although some people that were at the very, very far end of the atoll did stay, that were like 12 kilometers away, were contained there. But most of the, because for example, that was in Eniwetok, where there was just a few tests. But in Bikini, they were all evacuated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Two quick comment and question. The first thing that you said when you talked about people now being dislocated and living basically as dependent on the government. One of the interesting things, tragically interesting, certainly in Fukushima, but also in other parts, is not getting enough aid to survive in that way. So instead, rather than it being a government largesse that turns them into passive and dependent people, in fact, almost all of them, whether it's from tsunami or from radiation, are struggling to even become dependent, trying to patch together whatever little bits of money, oftentimes from friends, they're able to do. So the other thing, I just want to go back to when the very first thing you said was about bringing the different kinds of people together into some sort of coordinated, unified global movement. I think we've mentioned this before, but the strong resistance among Fukushima residents to be called Hibakusha, that we are not Hibakusha, and for reasons that I think we can all imagine, that we're trying to combat the stigma, not wanting to participate in that post-war legacy for fear, if nothing else, that they know what happened to those Hibakusha, and trying to make common cause with them would be even a compounding of that situation. Have you seen any shift over time in people's willingness to take on that name or use that kind of term for themselves and lead to any kind of political alliances?
I think in most of the test site communities, people don't use the word Hibakusha, but they speak of themselves as nuclear victims or nuclear survivors. So they don't necessarily use that word. Most of our work in the Global Hibakusha Project is with third generation Hibakusha, and there's not that same sense of stigma that there is for those who directly experienced it, partly because the history is distant enough that that the same associations that the first generation that experienced the exposures were afraid of, the same stigmas that came in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that also people are anxious about acquiring in Tohoku. So in most of these, most of the people are people who were exposed a long time ago. So they've gone through the periods in their lives of marrying or not marrying or going through suffering the social stigma. Most of them come from small enough communities and populations that everybody was exposed. So there was not the same insider-outsider kind of dynamic that there is in a more populated, exposed population. In Chernobyl, in Belarus and the Ukraine, there's some amount of a desire to have a formal designation as a radiation exposed person because of the quality of health care it opens you up to. So people actually, it's not always the case, but there's some documentation and some scholarship done about the politics of acquiring a radiation exposed identity in the Ukraine and in Belarus. But our work is with third generation Hibakusha. And for those communities, it's primarily seen as a matter of political empowerment more than there is any presence of anxiety over the stigma. So there's there's among a lot of the young people in these communities think that this is not any part of their identity at all. This is their grandparents' history. You know, this didn't happen to them. They weren't alive when this happened. So their identity is not necessarily, so for them to participate in some of the stuff we're doing in our project is more an act of community empowerment than identity-based politics. It's a different situation than it is, of course, in Tohoku.
Thank you very much for doing this work. It's rare that I can feel I've been so enlightened about such a major force in our world. So thank you for sharing that with us. And one thing that you mentioned early on was the new normal. So maybe half of our radiation burden of everyone in the room comes from the nuclear testing. But actually, there's a new normal in a lot of aspects of life on this planet. And we're not heading in a very productive direction. And a lot of people might have similar experiences in Hibakusha that have nothing to do with radiation, to do with environmental contamination, which now happens on a local or regional scale, but it could very soon happen on a global scale of catastrophic proportions to make even the disruption you're talking about look small scale.
Sure.
So I wonder, you know, the future, it's not just a question of nuclear, but overall, how we manage to organize our lives on this planet.
Absolutely. I don't mean this to be that our future is all tied to the future of radiation-exposed communities. I mean, for those people. But you're absolutely right. And certainly when we consider such challenges as climate change, and as you say, the toxic burden from, especially in developing countries, it can be every bit as big of a burden. And
imposed unequitably.
And imposed, exactly. I agree. There's the politics of globalism, of global capitalism, are definitely a challenge to marginalized populations everywhere, and the legacies of development as well. So I agree. So I'm just speaking about one narrow segment, but it is of a kind with a lot of what the modern world is. I agree.
Go ahead.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming all the way to Tokyo and Temple, Japan. It was a pleasure to hear you talk. I just wanted to note, based on your research and the people that have been exposed to these episodes of radiation in the past, like, how would you comment on the response to this particular episode of radiation contamination, being that it's in such like a present time, so recently, a different time period, and that it's been in such like a highly developed country such as Japan?
Yeah. Of course, it's really different. Nuclear testing happening in isolated, you know, essentially being linked to a history of colonialism in a sense, is very different than nuclear power plant accidents, especially in a modern country like Japan. But I would say that I'm still upset over the way that things happened in Japan. I think that for all official sources to deny the meltdowns for a period of almost 3 months in which it was known, not even suspected, but known, is a dishonesty that's unforgivable. And so for me, the credibility of people who lied for months about public danger and about something that was clearly going to have to be admitted eventually, there's a great deal of credibility lacking. So the way that whole thing unfolded continues to traumatize people. For people to have anxiety over whether they're being exposed to radiation or not, to be wondering whether or not to evacuate their homes, and to be told for some period of time, there's nothing to worry about, you're perfectly safe, and then to later be told, actually, you do need to evacuate, or actually there is a problem, is a form of traumatizing. It's an emotional trauma regardless of the radiation exposure. And I would also say that there has been, I'm really encouraged by the community formation around the population in Tohoku, the amount of people who have been focused on working there, as well as the amount of people who have been focused on things like getting accurate information about radiation to the public. It's been really impressive that at this time, we don't have to depend on official pronouncements to understand radiation levels in different places, but community can generate that kind of information. That's a tremendous step forward, but that was done by by personal initiative of people in the community. One of the things that's most upsetting to me here in Japan is the continuing energy put into blaming people in Tohoku for their health problems, for their own health problems, which is known officially as radiophobia. The notion that the reason that people are having health problems is that they have anxiety about radiation. This was done in Hiroshima. This has been done in all of these test site communities, that when health problems develop, part of what happens is that there's always an effort to say, oh, this is because, these people are a little crazy in a way. And I hear plenty of that, and I see plenty of that in the press. Just the fact that that kind of comment can be published, or that people can say that radiation doesn't harm you, or that a little bit of radiation doesn't harm you, when it's absolutely, there's no truth to that at all. There's not, there in newspapers and in official statements, there's just not very much critical thinking as opposed to repeating of what's supposed to be said. And for me, a lot of what is, where the idea of what's supposed to be said comes from is from the same people who told us there were no nuclear meltdowns, when it was obvious to anybody that understood reactor physics that there had been nuclear meltdowns on the second day and the third day. So I had, when it first happened, I thought things would be much better in Japan, than they turned out to be. And so I've been very disappointed by the official operation of social institutions, but I've been tremendously encouraged by the behavior of community outside of formal social institutions. I think that there's a lot more active support for the community of people who have been evacuated, the people of community who are living in contaminated areas, coming from social groups of volunteers. That's really encouraging. But it's discouraging to see that the government has not done more for people, and that the government did not manage the evacuations and moving people away from contaminated areas. When, for example, you raise the level of legal exposure for a child to what is the universal level that adult nuclear power plant workers are allowed to be exposed to, that's a really cynical move to make. And essentially it's a way of saying that these children's lives are not important. So that's really disappointing. That's just, some of the things that happened in the first few months, just, I felt brutalized by as somebody not experiencing any exposure to radiation.
If I may make a point just to follow up on what Bo was saying, I've been doing research on the nuclear crisis, and I can attest that absolutely nuclear experts knew that there had been a meltdown. Those hydrogen explosions of the buildings, that's the only way that could have happened. And secondly, the Japanese government in TEPCO did not announce that there had actually been meltdowns until the day before an international delegation from the International Atomic Energy Association arrived in Japan. And perhaps because the director of the IAEA is a Japanese politician, they knew quite well that they were going to basically out that information. So they got in front of it, but only by one day.
And I would just add to that from the point of view of the nuclear power industry, that's a PR success. Because when the entire world was focused on Fukushima, they were able to keep the word meltdown off of the front pages of newspapers around the world. And when they did finally admit that there were meltdowns, that admission was on page 10 or page 12. Keeping the word meltdown off the front page of newspapers, that's a PR success.
You talked about some of the health effects the people that were exposed during the testing had. in your experience working with second or third generation people, do they also have any kind of medical issues or?
Yes, it differs from community to community depending on the kinds of exposures. There's a lot of variance. But there definitely is higher rates of cancer, higher rates of immune disorders specifically, and perhaps among the worst next generational effects has been at Chernobyl, where the worst health effects that we have seen in Chernobyl so far are being seen in the children born to people who were exposed as infants or toddlers. But that's a different kind of exposure than from the nuclear testing. And it's also a little hard to separate out. For example, in Kazakhstan, there's quite a lot of ongoing illness, but people are also still living in contaminated areas. So it's hard to determine what aspects of that are genetically inherited and what aspects of that are environmentally occurring. One of the things that I would add, just in terms of the kinds of epidemiological work that gets done around this, is just an anecdotal story about the way that people talk about radiation, people who study radiation. But a friend of mine is a lifelong prominent epidemiologist who worked for years at the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. And I asked him a question that's driven some of my research, which is in the ABCC, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, was set up in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the theory was, for whatever reason, you have a population of over 100,000 people who are exposed to radiation, provides a unique opportunity to track the health of these people and assemble a database on what the health effects of radiation are. This study is called the LIFE study, and it's sort of the gold standard of what radiation effects lead to what health effects. There's a couple things wrong with it, a variety of things that are wrong with the study, which I won't go into all of them, but for example, it was begun in 1950, so people who died early are not included in that study. But the question I had for my friend was, the key to this study is to assign doses to people, to say you were exposed to this much radiation. Because if you don't know what amount of radiation someone was exposed to, then the health effects are irrelevant. You can't say this health effect is a result of this level of exposure. So a lot of work was put into assigning doses to everybody, all the survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's really problematic because, first of all, in the case of the Hiroshima bomb, it's the only bomb of that design that was ever detonated, so we're not quite positive exactly what happened, exactly how the radiation was distributed from the bomb itself. You have to know exactly where somebody was to determine how much gamma radiation they received, so all kinds of strange things were done, which I'd be glad to tell anybody later, about trying to determine what that specific dose of radiation was for each person. People have to remember where they were, not just what building they were in, but what room of what building, how many rooms were in the building, what furniture was in the room, what part of the room were you in, did you have breakfast that morning, did you not have breakfast that? So these are people who are reporting this 10 years after the most traumatic thing that ever happened to them, where they may have seen family members die, may have been anxious about dying. So this information you can see how it gets problematic to get a really accurate dose assignment. But that's the key to this study. So what I wondered about is that a lot of this work for me started by studying the nuclear veterans in Nevada, the soldiers that took part in the tests. In this group of people, you know exactly where everybody was. Everybody wore a dosimeter, so you have an exact gamma radiation dose for every single person. You have a prior medical history for every single person, and you are also now the healthcare, as the US government, the healthcare provider for these people. So you have all of those problems solved of assigning dose and then tracking health. So I asked my friend, I said, why wasn't this group, there were over 400,000 soldiers that took part in nuclear tests, why wasn't this group ever identified as a group worthy of study in order to determine the relationship of their exposures to their health problems? And he said to me, he said, well, none of them were close enough to experience significant amounts of radiation. And so I said to him, I said, well, that's gamma radiation, which is the rays that come from the detonation itself. I said, but what about alpha-emitting particles? Because all of these people, were walking around in a dust cloud, and inhaling this, and it was getting in their eyes and things like that. And he said, "Oh, I never thought about that." And so the danger of alpha-emitting particles is left out of these studies. And when we talk about the situation of the health effects for these Hibakusha and nuclear test site communities, and also, as you know, when we talk about the health effects of people in Tohoku, the dangers of internalized alpha-emitting particles is left out. And so that, in a sense, is a part of what becomes the new normal too, is that those exposures are not included. Those exposures are not ever seen as resulting from these accidents. So a lot of the people in these communities still live with a lot of alpha-emitting particles. The people that live in contaminated areas, like in Kazakhstan, it's not the gamma radiation that's making them sick, because the gamma radiation is low. It's the presence of all these alpha-emitting particles being stirred up by dust, being taken up by plants in the garden, being, ending up in the milk of the horses and stuff like that. That's where the dangers come from. And so those are almost impossible to assign causation for the kinds of diseases that come with that. So there are definitely health effects in these communities, but it's difficult to say that they're genetic or environmental. Except in the case of Chernobyl, where it clearly looks as though it was genetic.
Some distance. This will have to be the last question.
Yeah, okay.
Some distance away from me.
But it's also that thing right there.
Move the mic.
Okay. I assume you're familiar with the work that's been done by Safecast here in Japan?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, Safecast was organized because the government was not putting out much or any or accurate information. So it's a good example of crowdsourced radiation monitoring and all that. And we're actually working with people up in the Fukushima area to make their own radiation monitoring devices, and we've gone over, I think, 10 million data points in our database for all of Japan. So if anyone wants to get some information about that, you can talk to me afterwards.
Oh, fantastic! I was a contributor to the Kickstart of Safecast, but that's an example of community response that's really tremendous and admirable here in Japan. And that's an example of people taking power into their own hands. So I definitely think that the work done by Safecast is exemplary.
We're out of time, but I wanted to thank Bo very much for the trouble of coming here. Great lecture. Bo, could you speak just for a moment about your collaborative projects and also maybe about where people can get your book?
Oh, sure. Well, my main project is this Global Hibakusha Project, but the Global Hibakusha Project is also working with various other groups. There's a group called the Nuclear Futures Initiative Project in Australia that is working on developing arts and community expression in exposed populations. There's a group in the University of Manchester called Places of War, which is also collecting art. A lot of what we're focused on is community expression too. And so there's a number of projects, a number of really good projects that are focused on the production of art in war zones, nuclear and also just other war zones of any conflict type. Also, we have this December at the Hiroshima Peace Institute, sponsored with the Chugoku Shimbun in Hiroshima, international symposium on the maintenance of memory in traumatized communities. We have speakers from several genocide communities, and also, of course, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In terms of this book, the Japanese edition, both the Japanese edition and the English edition, which are both called The Dragon's Tale, are available through Amazon Japan or Amazon, any of the Amazons. And what that talks about is the establishment of nuclear culture in the United States. It's looking just at the United States, and its central argument, which I'll give you in 2 sentences, is that the first primary nuclear narrative, which has colored all nuclear issues since then, is that nuclear technology, nuclear weapons, gives humanity a choice. Either we have to learn to avoid war and become a more peaceful kind of creature, or we're going to kill ourselves. This is what people said in 1945 after the bombings. And that my argument is that this narrative, this is a narrative that says nuclear weapons are a signifier of impending social change. Either humans are going to suddenly become nonviolent and we'll live in an abundant society with abundant energy, or it's going to be the end of the world. And this kind of magical talk and mythical talk has always accompanied almost all discourse around nuclear issues and makes it very difficult to talk realistically about nuclear technology. So that's available in Japanese or English.
Thanks so much. I have just thank you again, Bo. Just a quick announcement. We have another event coming up somewhat related to this on July 22nd. Martin Fackler, who's the senior editor of the New York Times in Japan, and Richard Lloyd Perry, who's the Asia editor of the Times of London, will both discuss their papers' coverage of the tsunami and nuclear crisis. And I welcome you to that. If you'd like to be added to our mailing list, please leave your mail sheet. We are a nonprofit organization, but we do incur some expenses. There's a donation box if you might consider that. But in any case, we hope to see you again. And again, thanks to Bob.